you very much for coming to this, the first of the 2017 series of What's for Dinner speaker events. I know many people are making repeat visits after last year, but there are some new faces as well. So although I don't want to bore the pants off everybody by repeating in great detail what I normally say at the start, if I may, I'll just repeat a few salient points. The series is about the future of food production and farming. We all know the conventional wisdom that treats farming purely as a business activity, like any other business activity, or tool for making profit, and enhancing that profit as much as possible by the standard commercial measures of making economies of scale, etc., etc. But when these measures cause the industrialization of livestock keeping and the consequent degrading deaths of animals kept in such hellholes, then one does not have to be an eco-warrior to ask if that is really the right way forward for agriculture, or whether it is truly sustainable, let alone beneficial. Similar questions might be asked about some modern ways of raising crops. It is said, perhaps a bit dramatically, that only the lack of 9 consecutive meals would mean the collapse of modern society. A bit dramatic perhaps, but it does suggest that the title of the series, What's for Dinner, is just as important as any of the other political questions that confront us. In Jersey, what would happen if there was an interruption to regular food imports for either political reasons or some sort of environmental emergency? And how much more then would we be concerned with what's for dinner than with some of the other questions that preoccupy us, such as state reform? So that's the theme of the series. Best summarizes alternative ways forward and ideas presented by visiting experts in their field from outside the island. The travel expenses of bringing them here have been very kindly funded by the Howard Davis Farm Trust, which is the modern evolution of the measures taken by the late T.B. Davis to promote education in agricultural matters. The use of this location for a meeting has been kindly provided by the Royal Jersey Agricultural and Horticultural Society. The meeting and the What's for Dinner series have been organised by Rural Magazine. And excuse me if I sometimes refer to the magazine and myself interchangeably. It is because, to parody Louis XIV's, the magazine c'est moi. So, before introducing the speaker, may I just make a small plea, usually delivered at the end of the evening, but I would not wish anyone who wants to make a speedy getaway afterwards be unaware of the fact that there's a champagne bucket just outside the entrance to the room. No champagne or nice inside it, unfortunately, but it does make a convenient receptacle for a retiring collection, which helps contribute to the other costs of this evening. So, sustainable farming and food production being the subject of the series, the best person to give us some thoughts on this is tonight's speaker, Patrick Holden, formerly the director of the Soil Association, and now the founding director of the Sustainable Food Trust, a new organisation, or relatively new, that campaigns internationally to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food systems. After studying biodynamic agriculture at Emerson College, he established a mixed community farm in Wales in 1973, a time when the word organic was hardly known, and if it was a matter for some derision. The farm produced at various times wheat for flour production, which is sold locally, carrots and milk from an 85-cow dairy herd, and that is now made into a single farm style cheese. Patrick was the founding chairman of British Organic Farmers in 1982, before joining the Soil Association, where he worked for nearly 20 years. During that time, the organisation led the development of organic standards and the market for organic foods. He was patron of the UK Biodynamic Association and was awarded the CBE for services to organic farming in 2005. In the course of his advocacy for a major global transition to a more sustainable food system, his speaking and broadcast engagements take him around the world. He's off to Copenhagen in the morning, and this evening, of course, he is now in Jersey. So, time for me to shut up and let the speaker do the speaking.
Hello everyone, good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you again. I thought I'd start with a kind of update on, as has just been saying, an update on since I was last here, which allegedly was 2009, and somebody just said they thought it was about 3 years ago, which is what I thought, and in fact it was 8 years ago. But when I was last here, I was still working for the Soil Association, and during my time at the Soil Association, I was very much involved with building the market for organic food. And indeed, I was actually involved with drafting the very early standards for organic production, including the livestock standards. I wrote down a draft, the first draft, I think, in the world that might be claimed, of the organic dairy standards. And what that consisted of was simply a description of what we were doing on our own farm, because there were no livestock standards at the time, and so we just wrote down what we were doing as a starter. And the whole history of the genesis of the organic market, this is my perspective on it, is interesting in the current context, because at the time there were quite a few people like me who were urban refugees who got out of London and other cities and went back to the land, influenced by kind of hippie thinking at the time, really. Because I was in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my dad was posted out there. He was a visiting professor at Stanford University in 1971. And I came back for a kind of youthful idealism and convinced we were on the edge of an ecological catastrophe, and the only sensible thing was to get back to the land and set up a rural self-sufficient community, which is what we did. And the community didn't last very long, but I'm still on the farm. The farming project really was born out of this kind of thought that we ought to farm more with the grain of nature and work in a different way. And the organic project came out of that. But the reason why we developed the organic project, from my perspective anyway, was we pretty soon found that if we were going to farm in a more sustainable way, we couldn't make it pay. Because the Common Agricultural Policy, because we just joined the EU in 1975, was subsidising everything that was produced, and the fertilisers and the pesticides were available really at scale for the first time. So the more food you produced, the more you got paid for it. Everything was subsidised and guaranteed. But if you were not using those inputs, you produced less. And especially if you didn't know what you were doing, which we didn't really know, because we were just learning as we went, although I had a bit of experience before arriving at the farm. So we thought, well, why not write down what we're doing and take our story of an attempt to farm in a more sustainable way to the consuming public and ask them to pay more for it in the marketplace. And that really was the story of the development of the organic standards of the market. It was an attempt to make economic sense of a system of production which wasn't viable without a premium. But now, with the benefit of a lot of hindsight, I've come to the conclusion that we were in developing a separate market for organic food, we were treating the symptom, not the cause of the problem. And the cause of the problem was that the farming systems that we are using and have been using throughout the post-war period have been based on the ability of the new technologies in farming to exploit natural capital, but not being accountable for the damage that those systems have caused to the environment, to soil, to biodiversity, to public health. And because of that, we've been able to produce food which appears cheap, but isn't really cheap, because there's the price you pay in the shops and then the price we're all paying later, and it's rather like having some audited accounts where there's no balance sheet. And the balance sheet of farming is the natural capital that we're the stewards of, the soil, the biodiversity, actually the social capital too, with people that work on the land. And during the last 4 or 5 decades, we've extracted the natural capital that we've inherited and not been accountable in our balance sheet for its loss. And there's downstream consequences of our food and farming practices, which are now threatening the whole of life on Earth, or certainly human life on Earth. And I'm saying that, but a more authoritative source of that statement comes from a man called Professor Johann Rockström, who invented this concept called planetary boundaries. And this is the idea that planet Earth has a certain carrying capacity of resources, and we, the citizens of planet Earth, need to live within the planetary boundaries of the resources that are available to us. And he came up with this idea, I think it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago now, of planetary boundaries, and where he looked at each of the areas of resource consumption that were exceeding the carrying capacity of the planet. And he's come up with 5 of them in particular, about which he gave a talk in Oxford about 4 or 5 months ago. I think David Attenborough was on the same platform. And he said that when you look at the key areas where we are exceeding the planetary boundaries, namely emissions that cause climate change, soil degradation, water, biodiversity, and nitrogen, all of those areas are seriously exceeding the planetary carrying capacity. And then when you trace them back to where the cause of that resource depletion is, it all goes back to food and farming. And at the end of this talk, he basically says, if we're going to avoid irreversible climate change and some sort of ecological breakdown, we have to change our food and farming systems. And then he goes on to say, I'm not talking here about going to developing a niche market, like organic farming. Actually says like organic farming. He said in my part of the world, which is Sweden, some of the markets for organic foods are now up to, I think it's 30%, even more than that, for some dairy products. He said, I'm not talking about that sort of a change. I'm talking about the whole of agriculture. Because unless we change the whole of agriculture, we're not going to avoid these breakdowns. And he said, we need to get this transition in place by 2050, which means really we have to start by 2020 with this serious scale transition of our farming systems away from this resource depleting extractive model towards a model which lives within the planetary boundaries. And then if you take it on a farm level, that we are the stewards of the natural capital on our farm, and we need to leave it as we found it, or preferably better than we found it. And we have to transition to farming systems that have those characteristics. And in my opinion, and I'm saying this against myself in a way, I'm not against the development of the organic market. I'm not going to stop farming organically or being certified organic. But I think it's a dangerous thing now for the organic movement to say we're better and the other people are not so good because they're not organic. And I think this polarization of the farming community between those that are something which is allegedly good and those something which are not good is no longer helpful. And it's not that the organic project won't continue, and it's not that we maybe through these certification and market schemes have developed systems of production which are part of the solution of the future. But certainly I'm speaking about my own experience on my own farm. I'm just beginning to learn things now, and I've learned it in the last few years that make me feel that I'm just at the beginning of the journey, as many other farmers will be, of this really grand transition which needs to take place. And although I wouldn't say that my stepping down from the Soil Association was directly related to what I've just described, it was in part. And the mission of the organisation I work for now, which I founded, a bit like the magazine, we're a very small organisation, there are 9 of us working in it, and we're trying to work catalytically, as you said, to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food systems. And the work that we are doing is on 3 levels. We're trying to influence people in positions of leadership, because we think that if people who are responsible for large organisations or large food companies or government or foundations that support charitable causes, if they have a different view about things, that's a good start. But if you only work at the top amongst the leaders, change won't happen. So it's got the change has got to be top, middle, and bottom up. And the middle bit, I think, is changing the policy and economic environment in which all food producers operate, so that doing the right thing by the planet and public health, they can become more profitable, and that eventually there can be a better business case for doing that than there is to do the other thing, which is causing depletion of natural and social capital. So unless we do that, even if the leaders think it would be a good thing to go in a different direction, if the producers themselves can't make a business case out of doing it, it's not going to happen. And how's that going to happen? Well, we think that has to be driven by informed public opinion. So until the citizens, who are the food consumers and eaters, understand deeply enough to feel that this is an electoral issue, and also transfer their habits away from just eating anonymous food where it's cheap but they don't know where it comes from or what its production story, towards insisting on food that has a known story with a known farmer and a known production system behind it, then I don't think the change will be possible. So we really have to work at three levels: top down, in the middle, and bottom up. And that's what the Sustainable Food Trust is trying to do, but on a very energetic level. It's rather like, sort of homeopathy or something, because there aren't enough of us. It will be up for other organisations and groups to deliver the change, because we're just a very small group. But just to give you an example of some of the work I'm doing at the moment, last night I was with the board of Mars. Mars, the confectionery company, there was seats of chairs, and they do the cake thing. And the chairman of the board, who's I think he's the great-grandson of the founder of Mars, and a lot of the other Mars descendants were in this restaurant in London, and I spoke about some of the things that I'm going to discuss with you tonight. And you could say, well, Mars is about the last company you think would be interested in this, but they really are, because I think there's an awareness growing now all over the world that the present system is no longer fit for purpose and change is needed. And I believe that part of our work is not to demonise food companies that have been doing things which maybe haven't been in the interest, the public interest until now, because like the farming community, they are trapped and they have to follow the best business case. And if the best business case is being produced to buy commodity food at an ever lower price, process it heavily, turn it into food which appears cheap in the marketplace, which is actually causing damage, and that's the only way that they can keep their jobs as executives, or keep the company viable, or in the case of farming, moving more and more towards very large-scale operations, producing commodity crops for global commodity markets. That's not their fault. It's all of our fault that we've witnessed this situation of waiting much more sustainable family farms towards this sort of global commoditized approach in not very long. And we are all responsible for that, because we're finally the people who buy the food and are chasing the price down. And that makes farmers commodity slaves. So we're all in this together, and that's what we have to change. And that's what I'd like to sort of delve into a little bit in the next few minutes, and then let's have a discussion about it. The theme, which I think in a way is the end driver that I want to explore, is what should I eat to be sustainable and healthy? Because surely that must be our question that arises out of what I've said. So if you agree that we've got a problem, and that unless farming changes, which is the world's predominant land user, and has been responsible for the massive decline in biodiversity, which has been responsible for the greatest single share of emissions which could be reversed, which has been responsible for mining the soil capital and all the other things that Johan Rothschild was saying, then it follows that we have to change our farming systems, and we need to align our future diets to the productive capacity of the farms that will be farmed in a more sustainable way. Because unless we do that, how can the farmers possibly survive? So we've really got to think about how we can shift our dietary habits to be better aligned in the particular place at which we find ourselves, Jersey, West Wales where I am, wherever it is in the world, it doesn't matter because the same issues apply, so that our staple foods, the foods that are going to sustain us in the main, not the luxury foods obviously that may be produced somewhere on the other side of the planet, but the foods that we really rely on to keep us healthy and well, should be consumed in proportion to what the farms of our region can actually produce. So just to take the United Kingdom as an example, there have been tremendous trends over the last few years towards vegetarianism and veganism. I'm told that veganism has gone up by 350% since the millennium, and a lot of young people in particular think that livestock farming is bad and that plant fats are healthier than animal fats. And yet, if you look at the landscape of the United Kingdom, more than 70% of it, of the agricultural area, is grassland. And for most farmers in the West, grassland's the only option. That's my part of the world, West Wales. I have a 300-acre farm. We've got a 75-cow dairy at the moment. We've got closed down with TB. We can't be able to replace cows, but we'll probably go up a bit from there to probably 100. But although we are growing crops on our land, it's only this year 40 acres, and the rest is grass. And if you look at the grassland areas of Scotland and Wales and the west of England, and actually even the east of England, where the arable farming is, we're a predominantly grassland nation. And if the farmers who are growing continuous arable crops are going to change their practices to rebuild the lost soil fertility, which is the inevitable consequence of long runs of arable crops, you just take the organic matter of the soil down from 4 or 5% to maybe as low as 1%, then they will have to go back to crop rotations and mixed farming to rebuild the lost soil fertility. Now, if you're an arable farmer in the east of England and you've just got 1,000 acres of wheat, barley, whatever, oilseed rape at the moment in flower, and you go back to a rotation which has a fertility building element, which will take CO2 out of the atmosphere. By the way, it's been estimated that if all the tillage land in the world shifted back to mixed farming with a fertility building element to the crop rotation, we could take up to 100 parts per million of CO2 out of the atmosphere, because the soil is the world's largest carbon bank, bar the oceans, and it's the only way we can actually reverse the emission consequences of the fossil fuel consumption and the changes in agricultural practice. So if those farmers in the east of England were to convert to sustainable systems, 40% of the land area would go into grass. So if you then extrapolate that across the United Kingdom, we need to remind ourselves that in order to make money out of farming grassland, the farmers will have to have ruminant animals and some grass-fed or partly pasture-fed poultry and pigs as well, but predominantly ruminants, because ruminants are the only animals that can digest and virtually subsist on the cellulose, which is the fertility building element of the crop rotation, or in the west of Britain, permanent grassland. And so when I say we should think about what we eat in proportion to what this country or this island can produce and align our diets accordingly, that means that red meat, controversially, which has got a very bad health image for no good reason, and is perceived to be bad for climate change because the methane emissions of the animals is actually part of the solution, not part of the problem. And for those of you who are worried about the methane emissions of the ruminants, if you practice proper rotational farming, the soil carbon gain offsets the methane emissions of the animals. And in any case, the methane cycle is as old as the planet itself in a way, because we've always had grazing herds on the grasslands of the world. We've always had grazing herds of ruminants, and the methane goes up into the atmosphere, breaks down, and then is cycled again. The new methane and the fossil fuel consumption is the real culprit of potentially irreversible climate change. And it's a sort of trade-off in a way. We need the ruminants to rebuild the soil fertility, the soil carbon gain offsets the methane emissions of the ruminants, and what's more, grass-fed ruminants are really actually, they produce a meat and fat with a good ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids. So if you compare the fats that we all used to consume, apparently according to my colleague Richard Young, the beginning of the last century, I think it was something like 70 or 80% of the fats we consumed came from animals, with 20 or 30 from plant fats, and now it's been reversed. But where the fats that we're eating today come from? Palm oil from the Indonesian rainforest, which is causing the extinction of the great apes, and it turns out palm oil isn't even a particularly healthy fat. Oilseed rape, which is causing huge damage because of neonicotinoids to insects, bees, and that sort of thing, and other soya oil from North and South America, which is causing devastating impact on the environment. So our dependence on fats has shifted from the fat of our land, which is what it used to be 100 years ago, to the fat, the plant fat of other people's lands with devastating environmental damage. And that's, I think, a very good example of getting into a mindset of realigning what we eat with what we can actually grow and produce, and supporting the farmers to do that. And I think, it seems to me more and more, that if those sort of messages were to be got across to more policymakers and ordinary citizens, and schools and hospitals and all the people who are the decision makers, and they were to realise the consequences of our dependency on globalised, exploitative food systems which are causing so much damage, and which suggest and advocate that our future diets should be not only realigned to the productive capacity of the land generally, but actually specifically recoupled to the farmers in the community. So in other words, on this island, if one asked oneself the question, what would the farmers of Jersey grow if they were to, I know that there is a lot of sustainable farming already going on the island, but if it was to become more sustainable and give up its, our current dependency on nitrogen fertilizer and all the other inputs which are not sustainable, what food would the island grow on its, whatever it is, 30,000 acres, is it, of land which is farmed? 300,000 acres? 300,000, whatever it is. But these statistics, 20,000 acres, 100,000 people, the staple things that we could grow on the island and eat ourselves, the meats, the dairy products, the vegetables, whatever they are, in a rotational system that would sustain and build soil fertility without the use of damaging inputs. I would imagine that if all that food was consumed on the island, then you still have a massive gap, but it would be no worse economically for the producers, because there's advantages of eating home-produced food, and it would be a whole lot better for the economy of the island, because you wouldn't have this money going out, and the islanders would be healthier. And yet that understanding of the benefits, environmental, social, cultural, and health-wise, of eating food from producers near you with a known story, which means that you're supporting the community and all the sort of circular benefits of a closed economy. If that message could be got out there, it could transform the soils of the island, the biodiversity of the island, and probably the health of the island. And so my question to you, or maybe for a discussion, is how could that happen? And why is it that that change is not happening more widely? Because that's another thing that is obviously not happening. So I want to move on to ask the question, if the right diet to be sustainable and healthy is not, the switch that is not happening, which it isn't fast enough for what Johan Rockstrom says is needed, why isn't it happening? What could be done to make it more possible? One of the reasons, I think, as I've already touched on, is that if you switch from an intensive farming system, which is growing large volumes of commodity crops, to a more sustainable system, at the moment you will make less money if you're a farmer. That is because, whether you're in the US, where I've just been last week, where the Farm Bill is subsidising farmers to grow corn and soy in a narrow rotation, they have a thing called crop insurance over there, where the farmers are rewarded effectively to grow corn and soy that's used for ethanol production and animal feedlots, really. and they're trapped on a treadmill of only being able to grow those crops because the subsidies are reinforcing it. And I would say it's the same with the Common Agricultural Centre payment, but if that payment was made conditional upon adopting farming methods which were beneficial to the soil, beneficial to biodiversity, etc., in the mainstream, then I would say that would start to shift the business case for farming towards more sustainable practice. Just to give you one example, I spent some time with the German agricultural minister, and I went to the COP22 conference in Marrakesh with him and his team, and he was at the COP21 climate change talks in Paris, where the French minister, a man called Minister Le Foll, came up with a scheme which he called 4 per 1,000 cash per meal. And the 4 per 1,000 scheme, he suggested, should be an incentive scheme where farmers throughout the world should be paid or encouraged in some way to increase their soil organic matter by 0.4% per year. So that's where the 4 per 1,000 came in. And the Germans have realised that this could be transformative. So what the German minister wants to do is to work out how the common agricultural policy payments can be shifted so that farmers can be paid to be carbon stewards. So if you imagine that you're farming on Jersey and your organic matter is 2% or whatever it is, and you knew that if you were able to increase your soil organic matter by 0.4% per year, you would get a payment from the Common Agricultural Policy Pillar 1. But if you didn't do that, you wouldn't get the payment. That would be the sort of financial incentive which would start to shift the business case for farming in favour of a better approach. And then at the Mars meeting last night, I was with, I've forgotten his name now, the ex-Labour Party Minister of Health, who knows the Chief Executive of the National Health Service, because when he was Minister of Health, he knew all these people. So I said to him, look, if the National Health Service bills are escalating beyond the ability of the government to finance them, if we could show that changes in farming practice would lower rates of obesity and diabetes, would decrease cancers, would start to improve public health, and we could monetize that and put a price on the health gain of changed farming practice, do you think that would be interesting? And he said, yes, I think it would, and I think that the health service are in such a terrible state now, and the costs of it are just threatening to bankrupt our nation. I'm going to introduce you to this chap. So I'm now going to get an introduction to the Chief Executive of the National Health Service. And all this stuff about monetizing the costs and benefits of different farming systems is a project that we're heavily involved with, and we're calling it true cost accounting. We had a conference in San Francisco last April, the theme of which was the true cost of American food. And what we are trying to do is to get data to quantify and then monetize, in other words, put a price on the costs and benefits of different farming systems. So that if you take my farm, 300 acres, 85 cows, we're turning the milk into cheese on the farm, we're employing 4 people in the dairy, we haven't used any nitrogen fertilizer for 44 years, we've used no pesticides, we're employing more people on the farm, and we're building soil carbon. Most of those beneficial outcomes are not monetized. I don't know what the value of what we're doing is in terms of public health or environmental gain, nor do the farmers who are using more exploitative practices, who are more profitable, have to pay for the damage that they cause. So if we could make our farmers more accountable and rewarded, conversely, for farming practices which cause damage or farming practices which deliver public and environmental benefits, that would shift the dial in favour of more sustainable agriculture. And of course, soil carbon stewardship would be one of those examples. So our work is to try to get more data. There's a big project now which is EU funded and funded by a North American foundation to look at monetizing the damage which is caused to public health by industrial agriculture. Take one example, antibiotics. The use of antibiotics in America, 80% of all the antibiotics used in America are given to livestock in one particular. There's now causal links have been established between use of antibiotics and accelerated antibiotic resistance. And apparently there was a big international meeting in London recently, and the cost of antibiotic resistance to society as a whole is going to be measured in trillions of euros, dollars or pounds, I can't remember which, but enormous costs. And quite a bit of the cause of that goes back to agriculture. So if you monetize the damage and you go to the government or to the health service and you say, look, feeding antibiotics to animals is causing this enormous hidden cost, then you can start to make an argument to health people, or in the case of America, to health insurance companies, because they're picking up the damage of this in their health insurance premiums, that it would be worth incentivizing more healthy and sustainable agriculture, because there would be savings in health treatment costs. So true cost accounting is one of the in-the-middle policy areas that we're trying to work on to unlock this barrier to change, which a large part of which has been economic. Another bit is measuring sustainability. Right at the start of what I've said, I was talking about my role in helping develop the organic market, and particularly the organic standards. But this is my feeling about a farmer being inspected. I get inspected by Red Tractor, organic, because we're selling cheese, we have another audit which is called Salsa. We were multiple audited against with a range of different schemes, some of which overlap, and some of which are really quite confusing. And the public are quite ignorant about what they mean and what they don't mean. So yesterday we held a meeting in Leicestershire which brought together all the UK certifiers. We had Red Tractor in the room, we had organic, biodynamic, Leaf, which is another quite large certification scheme, and we had these sustainability assessment tools which are like spider diagrams where you look at the soil, the biodiversity, the resource use of the plant, and you score the farmers against them. But instead of there just being one tool, there are several of these tools. So the result of all this is overlap of cost, administrative burden, time burden, and consumer confusion. So what we are trying to do is to bring about convergence of sustainability assessment. And if you can imagine, I have my farm, I go through the organic inspection every year. It's a bit of an ordeal. I'm praying for that I won't have a non-compliance, because that would mean I can't be organic anymore. At the end of the day, when the inspector says, yes, you passed for another year, I feel a sense of relief. But it doesn't give me any incentive, because what I want to do is to improve my soil carbon this year from last year, or improve my biodiversity. And I would like that to be transparent, so people buy my food can say, this farm is gaining, and I can show that because I've got the data. And so what we're hoping to do is to be able to get one tool for sustainability assessment which all farmers would use, and then you could still use it for organic certification or something like that, but the people who buy the food would know more about its provenance, because they could look, you could have an app where you could see what the scores were, and everybody in the farming community would be on the same track going upwards, instead of, as I said at the beginning, polarising those that are and those that aren't, which is really rather a false divide, and I think something which we really need to move away from. So the barriers to change, policy, economic, and then thirdly, I think, lack of understanding of the issues. One of the things that we believe is very, very important is education. And we have just taken on, we are supporting financially, a head teacher from a primary school in Waltham-on-Thames called Richard Dunn, who read a book called Harmony, A New Way of Looking at Our World by the Prince of Wales about 5 years ago, and decided that the philosophy that was explained in this book, which is about everything being connected, and the same laws and principles really operating on everything in the world, and as expressed by the Fibonacci sequence, or the golden ratio, or the law of the octave and the musical scale, or the movement of the planets in the background of the sun, the gravitational forces that describe their orbits. All these mathematical and geometric laws are actually behind everything in life, but we've sort of forgotten them during the age of reductionism and exploitation. And it's sort of saying, this is very interesting, slightly esoteric. I'm quite a spiritual person. I go to church on a Sunday, whatever I do. And in my day job, I'm getting on with the material world and sort of operating in a reductionist and siloed sort of mentality. What the Prince is saying in this book is we need to realise the extraordinary complexity and interrelatedness of the world in which we find ourselves and try to make sense of it through that new prism of understanding. And this man, Richard Dunn, read this book and he thought, wow, in my school, I am not serving the interests of my children. I'm on a rat race of trying to get them to get through attainments, like he's Ofsted outstanding for the 12th year in a row. He's trying to get exam results. And he's thinking, he doesn't want to lose his Ofsted outstanding status, of course, but he said, how can I enable the children in my school to make better sense of the world in which they find themselves, and out of that understanding, know what to do to save the planet, if this doesn't sound too apocalyptic. So what he took upon himself was trying to embed this sort of harmony view into the curriculum. And he came up with this wonderful phrase called inquiries of learning. He said, don't tell children things, help them to ask questions and conduct inquiries of learning around themes. But make sure that that obviously does fit with the curriculum, because he didn't want to abandon his high status, because in his catchment area the house prices are going up. It's really a powerful driver. And he's managed to do that, and we are now his governors. He's a remarkable leader and a visionary man, really, and his governors have now allowed him to work outside the school for 2 days a week. He's attracting a lot of interest. One of the key advisors for the Secretary of State for Education is on his case, and he's now being asked to go into other schools and share this sort of harmony principle thinking with head teachers and others who want to look at education in a new way. And I'll just give you an example about what he's doing with food and farming and energy. He's got the children weighing the waste from the food that they eat at lunch every day. So they're the waste monitors. And if there's too high waste, then they go and they look to see why the children aren't eating the food, their peers aren't eating the food, because they have to wait, and then they compost it. And they're responsible for composting the waste in the school gardens. They've got 5 acres of gardens, and they grow vegetables and consume them in the school. He wanted to source as much organic food as possible, but the price was an issue. So he did a deal with himself, as it were, because you're not allowed to buy the food because of hygiene regulations from the gardens. So the gardens that produced the vegetables, they gave to the school canteen, and with that money, saved money, they spent more money on meat. And they've now got to 90%, this is a state school, 90% of the ingredients for the school dinners are organically sourced. And he's just done that by really thinking imaginatively about how he could do it in a different way and get the children involved with the process. He's also got a school food council that look after those sort of issues. Then he's got a school energy council who are responsible for monitoring the energy use. So they're thinking, a lot of lighting, they've got more natural lighting in the school, and they monitor on a weekly basis the energy use, compare it against last year. So these children, he's empowering these children to become leaders and thinkers about sustainability issues. So I'm increasingly of the view that we really need to think about educating a new generation of children, because the young people, the so-called millennials, are somehow more knowledgeable than we were about this, these issues. And it's as if there is some sort of inherited understanding which has come through us, yet interpreted in a fresh way, and they're ready to take responsibility for these challenges. And that is another element of which I think is very, very interesting, which I'd just like to share, which is that Rudolf Steiner, when he gave his biodynamic lectures, I don't know how many of you know about Rudolf Steiner. He was a sort of a thought leader and a spiritual teacher of the early 20th century who seemed to know things from somewhere, from God or from somewhere. And he was asked to give a series of lectures in 1924 to East German farmers, which became the beginnings of the biodynamic movement. And one of the things he said, he basically said farmers should farm more organic, more biologically. They should move away from chemical farming to biological farming, but they should also do other things. They should take account, they should use homeopathic preparations in their composts, and they should take account of the movement of the sun against the background of the zodiac in their planting and harvesting operations. So we've not got the time to look into that tonight. But one thing he said that I thought was extremely interesting is he said we should treat the farm as an ecosystem and try to breed the animals and plants from the same farm. And now, whatever it is, nearly 100 years later, the science is catching up with him. And I think that's another interesting thing to discuss, how intuition can be ahead of science. But now, rapidly evolving scientific understanding is catching up with the intuition of some of the early sustainable agriculture people. Because it turns out that epigenetic adaptation of plants and animals is responsible and continues to be responsible for plants and animals in nature, but also in farming operations, to adapt to the unique conditions of their place. And epigenetics is the science of gene expression. It turns out that all living organisms are constantly in an interactive relationship with their external environment. And at a cellular level, the gene expression alters. So for instance, if you have a hawthorn plant, which breaks into bud early in the spring, and you move it from the south of England to Scotland, over time, that hawthorn plant will epigenetically pass on changed traits which will allow it to blossom later to avoid the frosts. And this is not just natural selection, this is actually a dynamic thing which happens during our lifetime, but also is passed to future generations. A wonderful story about that is that a Harvard scientist took a batch of mice. He gave them a very strong smell, and then he split the mice into two. One batch he gave a strong but not lethal electric shock, and the other batch, just the smell. Then he bred from the mice, and 2 generations later, the grandchildren of the mice that had the smell plus the shock, and then the other batch that just had the strong smell, he exposed the grandchildren of these mice to the smell, and the ones whose grandparents had had the shock after the smell became agitated. So there is a 2-generational epigenetic transfer of an emotional trauma, in this case of mice. The science of epigenetics is discovering that environmental, food, emotional influences are passed down intergenerationally. So another example would be that sperm from men who have a diet of fast food makes their children more likely to be obese and that sort of thing. So in other words, we are all in this constant epigenetic, dynamic relationship with our external environment. And all the environmental influences and the traumas, both positive and negative, because this isn't just a negative thing, this can be a positive thing too, we can heal, have an ongoing and evolving effect on us. And to me, this is an incredible revelation, because although I knew intellectually, I knew that Rudolf Steiner said you should treat the farm, the animals and plants as a closed system. I thought, well, that's an interesting idea, but not really practical. But now you can see why he was saying that. And if you look at what's happened in agriculture, I mean, I've been a carrot grower, growing F1 hybrids, which is sort of dead end, which means you can't, they're not open pollination, you can't grow them. And I've been using AI, my Ayrshire cattle, which is a sort of global super breed from somewhere, I've no idea where the bulls come from, and et cetera, et cetera. So just about all the varieties of plants, crops, and animals that we're using in agriculture are absolutely not related to the place in which we farm. And it's only just begun to dawn on me how big a deal that is, because if you look at the gene pool in agriculture, it's been an incredible narrowing during my lifetime. I mean, there's just fewer and fewer varieties of plants and vegetables and animals that are more or less producing all the food we eat. And yet, somehow, on some deep level, we need to be re-related to the place in which we live. And this French word, terroir, this is the unique conditions of the soil on our farm, which is really about biology, it's about minerals, it's about climate, it's about everything. And we are an expression in an ideal world of the unique terroir of our environment, in this case Jersey, and yet all of us have abandoned that. We've become like global, homogenized citizens dining out on food with no known backstory from a producer that we've never met, or will never meet, and we can't even tell anyway. If we try to buy the stuff. So if you go into a supermarket and you ask yourself the question, how much do I know about the backstory behind the food products that are available to me in this supermarket, with this vast choice? The answer is very hard to buy any food where you really know the backstory. And I think that has to change. And, I'm not suggesting some sort of utopian world where everybody is buying all their food from their neighbours and, only if you know them personally and all the rest of it. And I am realistic about that. I was with Mars last night and I'm speaking at the Nestle Sustainability Conference in Geneva in about a month's time. And I believe it's really right that we should talk to these big companies. But I think as a direction, we should know more about the backstory behind our food. We should know it because of the epigenetic science. We should know it because also, I don't know how much of you know about the microbiome. This is another amazing revelation that has altered my attitude towards my soil management on my farm. Turns out that there are 3 times as many organisms coexisting in our bodies as there are cells. And most of them are in our stomachs. And they are like an ecological rainforest. There's a vast variety of them, and they play a dynamic relationship in maintaining our health. And if we take antibiotics, for instance, they get wiped out, so you have to start from base again. And they've now found that a lot of people have, problems with diarrhea and stomach conditions. And the best cure, and I heard this from the head of the public health in Iowa, a lecture she gave a couple of years ago, for people with untreatable diarrhea who have not responded to antibiotics, which in a way is not surprising because they've wiped out all the beneficial flora, is fecal implants, which are normally for some sort of, to make it feel slightly more comfortable, are donated by spouses. In other words, healthy fecal bacteria from somebody with a good stomach biome put into the stomach of the patient has an 80% cure rate, because it's like compost teas, if you know about that sort of thing, or it's inoculants of a complex bacterial community back into the stomach of a patient who's probably eliminated their microbiome through the use of antibiotics and maybe degraded food. And exactly the same thing's happening in the soil. So if you think about the soil is like the stomach of the plant. The plant doesn't have an internal stomach, it has an external stomach, and the external stomach is the root zone. And all plants spend 30% of their metabolic energy exuding sugary sap into the root zone, which nourishes a symbiotic community of bacteria and fungi upon which the plant depends for its digestion. So the soil is actually a digestive organ of the plants, or of the total community of plants. And there was a wonderful article about plant intelligence in the New Yorker a couple of years ago, written by Michael Pollan. And apparently, oak trees communicate with their cousins up to a quarter of a mile away through mycelia of the fungal community which inhabit the root zone. So this incredible, vast, complex, interrelated community of life of which we are part, and we have somehow separated ourselves from during the period of industrial agriculture. We now need to get to know this community again, because it is us, actually. It's not separate from us, it's part of us. So how we can make this journey from where we are at the moment, which is really from quite a degraded food system, which is not the fault of the farmers, it's not anyone's fault, because we just didn't know some of this stuff, back to a reconnection with the environment in which we find ourselves, where we can really be a better expression of humanity and the higher purpose of humanity, whatever that is, by being better connected with our food and our sense of place, and healthier as a result, I think is the challenge of our time. And I think that, in a funny way, an island community is very well positioned to lead in this, because you've got the natural advantage of being separated from the mainland, which is going to cause economic advantages for those people who are here and produce their own food. Also, you've got rich people here. I don't know how many rich people are here. I mean, you've got a lot of rich people who need to know this stuff, living on the island. Presumably they didn't know this, they weren't aware of this, but you know, it's still really important that they should know this stuff. And if they did know this stuff, maybe they would think differently about wanting to buy, you know, sustainably produced food from island farmers who need their help. So I better stop and throw it over to her. I think this is such an exciting time, and I think talking about epigenetics, millennials, they know something. They are like, I'm a hippie, and there was some sort of consciousness shift that was going on when I was late teens, early 20s, which sort of arose everywhere at the time. And I think that was an epigenetic shift. It probably came out of the war, it came out, I don't know what it came out, but it came out, it was everywhere. And I think that young people today, not all of them of course, but there was an environmental awareness amongst young people and an openness to change and a different attitude, which is really exciting. So if you think I'm talking a lot of rubbish, I'm probably having some rubbish, but I'd love to discuss all this. So let's.
Patrick, thank you very much indeed. Food for thought, one might say. As always, an interesting and thoughtful contribution to thoughts on the way ahead for farming, both in Jersey and nationally.
And internationally.
And of course, globally. Time for questions, and in the interests of allowing as many as possible, may I make a small plea that questions mean questions, rather than speeches. Patrick is going to be here for a while afterwards, poor man, he's got to wait until I load up my car. So, forgive me if I do cut anybody short, but there will be an opportunity to chat to him afterwards. So, question one, please. Yes.
Regarding what you said about when we buy food from the supermarket, how much do we know about the backstory of the food that we are buying? Are there conversations going on with schools training chefs and chefs organisations so that they can come through the places where people look to for leadership around food they're eating?
I think there are, and I think you're highlighting something incredibly important. I think that, you know, especially the new generation of chefs who are, I think a lot of whom are interested in this sort of thing, they need to, and there are so many, you know, chef television programs, and I think leadership from the chef community can be a really powerful influence on reminding people that they need to ask these questions. And is there an organised effort to do that specifically? There may be, but I don't know of it. But I think you're completely right that that should happen. People, all these iconic, you know, sort of very household name chefs who are very, very influential. I mean, obviously ranging from Jamie Oliver to Hugh Whitty-Storm and, you know, all these people. They need to lead this stuff. But I don't know of specific initiatives on the provenance area. Well, I think it's generally out there, but more and more people are asking these questions.
Yes.
It was just on the issue of meat and what you thought about meat and dairy and the price of it. I do a lot of work in South America with biodiversity trying to find it. And the number one driver of that is cattle farming. The 30% of that continent is under the hoof. And the second is soybean. That is really emerging. 95% of which goes to livestock farming to produce cheap meat. And you could draw a parallel with West Wales, where you're coming from, to a lesser degree than that's white plague, if you like, with the EU subsidy. And we've stripped away all our watershed, and we go into either stochastic events of climate change, flooding, droughts. What your thoughts were on, you know, sheep farming in West Wales, and does it draw a parallel to cattle farming in the Sahara and Amazon and South America?
Well, starting with West Wales, about which I know more than you do, you know more than I do about South America. I know something. George Monbiot has been very hard on the sheep, and I just think he's wrong. You know, I think he's very good at shouting loudly and getting attention, but I don't think he's wrong that we need to have some reforestation in Wales. But I think it's completely possible for mixed livestock systems, grazing system over the last few years, and this is inspired by people like Joel Salatin. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's a Virginia farmer who basically has developed a system of holistic or mob grazing where you graze the cattle and then you move them on. And the benefits of that are that you get a much more deep-rooting system of grasses, because when grass is grazed repeatedly, it sheds root mass, because all plants need to maintain a above and below ground ratio of their above and below ground biomass. And if you could repeatedly graze grass like cattle and lawn, it just sheds root mass. And so by moving the cattle on and having a system of electric you're mimicking the grazing animals that built the solvent in the first place. And in Wales, I'm sure that sheep, overgrazing of sheep, subsidising new sheep, has not been good, but we could do it a different way. And in South America, I know that there's been a lot of deforestation, and I guess we can't reverse that. But the soya issue can be changed, because we just shouldn't be raising cattle in feedlots. I mean, so all that stuff I said about ruminants, I should have said, hang on a minute, I'm not talking about feedlot cattle, I'm talking about raised ruminants being part of the solution, not feedlot cattle. So we have to differentiate. So that would mean that the cattle that are being fed soya in feedlots and the soy production of that is really a disaster. But if you've got already deforested land and you're not going to reforest it, then maybe grazing cattle managed in the right way isn't such a problem. You know, I can't speak with as much experience as you have in that South America. But I do know that if you just look at meat consumption in Britain, this is very interesting. Beef consumption is 40% lower than it was in 1980. Chicken consumption has gone up by 30% since the millennium. It's going like that. And lamb consumption is falling off a cliff, and probably George Monbiot is partly responsible for that. But millennials just aren't eating lamb anymore. And only old people like me are eating lamb. And even that's going down. So we are not being loyal to the farmers who want to switch to mixed farming systems. And that's what I think is not understood, that you cannot switch to a mixed farming system unless you can make money out of the grassland phase. So I think we need cattle and sheep, including dairy cattle, in the right context. But if you're saying that there are some systems of farming which are doing damage, of course that's true.
Yes.
As I said, just sort of on the same theme. In terms of South America and the equatorial rainforest and trying to save those areas, they're trying to, I believe, establish natural capital bonds where, and I'm just thinking of trying to translate what happens with the equatorial rainforest, what they're trying to do, whether this can be put in place by what you're saying in terms of more sustainable agriculture. Because it's all about the people in the place that need an alternative source of income.
Yeah.
And I just wondered what your thoughts would be on that.
Well, it's the whole thing about if you've got a system like palm oil in Indonesia, it's all very well me saying palm oil is an ecological disaster, which it clearly is. But what do you do to replace the income of all those communities who planted these plantations? That's a really difficult thing. It's really, you know, if we're saying we should unglobalize our food system and go back to a different kind of diet, you have to be sensitive to the communities that will be affected by that. And chances are, if you are not sensitive, it won't happen. So I don't know the answer to that question. I think it is probably one of the big challenges that.
No, I was just going to say, but it's not the communities that are doing it. Big business moving. The cattle ranchers, they're owned by shareholders in Canada and Europe. I mean, HSBC drive a lot of oil palm in Indonesia, you know, and they clear the communities off the land.
Yeah.
They need the forest for water and sustainability. So they're basically in way and clear the indigenous community.
Well, if that's the case, and it becomes more and more clear that the consequences of palm oil for the environment and for public health and for the great apes and everything else is totally disastrous, then maybe public pressure will mount, particularly if people know that it's not even good for us to eat these plant fats. So, I mean, yeah, you obviously know, if that's good in a way, isn't it? But if it's not, the communities are driving those plantations, it's more the multinationals.
It isn't the multinationals, it's us driving the multinationals.
Yeah, through our
Blame
consumption.
multinationals as often as you like, but until you stop buying the soap, and you stop buying the shampoo, and you stop buying the chloromargarine,
Yeah.
then
Well, exactly. That's
don't blame multinationals for what you choose to do.
no, but I think you're basically right. It's empowering to say we are the problem, therefore we are the solution. Because that means if we change, then the world changes. So that in a way it's more empowering to say unless they stop doing it. But that requires a change of understanding.
Can I say that transparency is really important because you mentioned shampoo, but it doesn't say palm oil in your shampoo, does it? It says sodium lauryl sulfate or something. How would the public know?
Well, I mean, I think more and more
They
do.
should ask,
Yeah.
what's lauric sulfate? You can say, what's that? I don't understand where does it come from?
I think this palm oil thing is getting more and more attention now. So I mean, thank God. It's a disaster, basically.
May I ask you whereabouts in West Wales you live?
Near Lampeter.
Near where?
Lampeter, which is about 23 miles south and a bit east of Aberystwyth, so quite west Wales.
And are you high or low or both, a mixture of both?
We're 700 feet on the yard. We're quite high rainfall. It's a lot harsher climate than here. Quite thin soils. It's not easy country to be dairy farmed.
Well, I lived in Wales. I was brought in the war. I was brought up in Wales, so I understand quite a lot about Welsh farming. But it's an interesting part of the world.
Lovely part of the world.
A beautiful.
What was
part.
your question? I'm sorry.
What is it?
To go back to this idea about knowing where your food comes from, would you agree that it's up to us to read the labels? If I buy meat, I want to know it's been reared and slaughtered and packed, and at least in the UK. I would rather have a little of something good than a lot of something bad. So would, in your opinion, would we be able to rely on such labelling? And would we also be able to rely on things like the red tractor and the organic labelling if we're looking, is it reliable? Should we be safe in our outlook, if you put it that way, in our ethics, to buy products that are labelled like that?
I think it's desirable that we make the labelling as good as it possibly can be. And as I was saying earlier, the current labelling is confusing because there are so many different schemes. I think that the individual provenance of products actually on the label, if we demand that, that would make a difference. I think the organic scheme is the best of the lot, basically, because it's quite well policed, but it's still not necessarily telling you where the food is actually produced. And I think we can do more also with this sustainability stuff that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah. But when you do buy something that says that it's been reared and slaughtered in the UK, I think that's fairly reliable, don't you?
Yes, but it would be even better if you knew that it had been reared and slaughtered on Jersey.
Yes, absolutely. But we do actually.
You've got an abattoir.
We have labelled Jersey meat now, which is absolutely excellent.
Yes.
And we buy it for preference, I'm sure we all do.
Yes.
Does
What
your
labels are product of fiction?
does your charity have a set of criteria for a sustainable farm to aim for? How are you
Well,
judging,
that's what we're trying to do in this meeting in Leicestershire yesterday is we're trying to develop a series of categories and metrics which are good indicators of true sustainable farming. And so that if I went through this audit, which I'm about to do actually, there's a scheme called the Cool Farm Tool, there's another one called Smart, another one called Rise. There are all these different sustainability assessment tools, but they're all different. And what we're hoping is to get the best of them all, like sort of put the chassis of one and the engine of another, and get a tool where a farmer will say, yes, that not only is a good measure of all the bits of my farming sustainability practice, but also a measure against which I want to assess myself year on year. And ideally, you want an app that you could just, you know, if you've got the data, you could fill it in yourself. And you can then use it as a management tool, as well as a source of transparent auditing. And so, for instance, instead of the Soil Association inspector coming to my farm and spending 2 days gathering data, I should be able to go online and enter the data and maybe be checked against it, a bit like a tax return. But I think it's about re-empowering the farmers. I think there are, this is too much other people coming in, and we need to take back control of our own audits to common standards.
You don't have that criteria at the moment?
Not yet, but that's what we hope will be the fruit of this work.
Yes, Robin.
First of all,
I'm sorry, Jay.
absolutely fascinating talk, and it chimes really with a lot of what I, as a farmer, believe about sustainable systems, mixed farming, the value of fat. Actually, fat is your friend in your diet. There's been a lot of rubbish about that, and finally that's coming. And the thing that some of these commentators like Morbihan, who's down on dairying as well as sheep, poisonous, really.
I know George, but
yeah.
I think he got meat as a
But-
child.
but- so what you're saying is so refreshing. But you say empowering the farmers, and a lot of what you're saying is from the producer's point of view. And you say you're talking to Mars, and they're a producer, a manufacturer. You're talking to Nestle, they're producers, so they're on your wavelength. But the farmer has to sell his produce, and he's selling in most cases to probably a national supermarket or a multinational thing. And he needs that contract. He's sort of imprisoned in that a bit, and to take these bold steps to be as radical as you're suggesting, which all you're saying is go back to the simple system, but it's a hugely radical step. And you talked about the dangers or the factors. One of them was the economics, but you didn't actually touch, and you missed completely the trading environment and the power of supermarkets who are the middleman, if you like.
Yeah, I didn't talk about that at all, and I agree with you completely. That is the big problem, because I did say we're commodity slaves, and I didn't mean that against the farmers. I'm saying we're in the same position. What we've done is we've added value to our own raw material. We started doing this in 2005. Until then, we were an organic commodity slave, if you like. We were selling our milk to Yo Valley, and we were price takers, not price makers. And now we're making about 85% of our milk into a single farm cheese with a name, so our identity survives the route to market. But I know that most farmers would not be able to do that if you're producing food which is going to be exported off the island or anywhere else. But I think more of us, if we could cultivate the community of interest amongst our own community, all the rich people of Jersey to buy our food, then more of us can sell our food with a story. There's a program in the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, called Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food. I think that's the kind of thing we need to do. And our own produce needs to have an identity which reaches the shop. And until then, we have to work with the big commodity buyers, including Nestle, and ask them to act in a more enlightened way. And they interestingly enough, a guy from Nestle was sitting on a Skype line in Geneva listening to the whole of yesterday's meeting, because they're interested in this. So, there's hope.
Right, one more. Yes.
You touched briefly on the relationships under the soil of mycorrhizal fungi and the benefits that those can have for perennial crops are well understood. Would you advocate for those people that actually plant annual crops to also to sort of build those relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the last chapter of agriculture has been about chemistry. The next chapter is going to be about biology. Mm-hmm. And we know so little about the biology of the soils that I know so little about the biology of my own soils. I might be farming organically for 40 years, and I don't really know much about the biology of the soils that I'm looking after. And some of it maybe I've got partly right just through, you know, intuition and just trying to do the right thing. But I think that we can probably, one of the things that I think is the most exciting opportunity is that we can actually build soil. And I think that's the whole key to the future of farming, whether we can speed up the building of soil by the right management practices. And part of that's crop rotation, part of that's composting, and the right kind of, you know, bacterial and fungal inoculants. We're just at the beginning of a new chapter, I think, and it is about, it's probably about biology, but it's also about other stuff as well. Even, I'm not saying spiritual stuff, but I think it's energetic as well as biological, what we need to do now.
I think you've hit the nail there. I think that's very true what you just said.
Yes, okay, one last one perhaps.
Would you like to know the origins of where farming turned?
Where farming turned?
Yeah.
How do you mean?
Well, it happened in 1963. The public voted for a man to go in and bring the price of food down.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing ever since.
Yes. And which was the man?
I can't remember because I was very old then. A lot of people in this room weren't born yet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but again, you know, even you could say politicians are us, aren't they? We elect them. So we're the powerful ones, because if we realise that it's the end of the road for a certain approach, and we regard these issues as electorally significant, because, you know, Theresa May, I met her when she was constituency MP for Maidenboy, she still is, and then she was Home Secretary, and she was a champion of the transition movement in Maidenhead. As a result of that, because one of her constituents has a chap who's running a biodynamic farm there, we went and had a meeting with her in her office in the House of Commons, and she seemed all over it at the time. And we sent a note to her when she became Prime Minister and said, would you like to meet a small group of us to discuss the importance of sustainable agriculture and health and nature stuff? And there was a warm response, and then after about a month, you know. And clearly she does not think that this stuff we've been discussing tonight is remotely interesting to her politically, because she does think it's going to be on the electoral issue. We have to get it on her electoral issue, because she's just a Pavlovian person who responds to public opinion. If this stuff becomes significant electorally, she'll listen. And I think that's empowering too, because you can assume that politicians will only do what we want them to do. In the end, they might be a bit thick-skinned and not hear it, but...
No, they'll do what they have to do to stay in power.
Exactly, which is the same thing. That's exactly right. So if we won't vote for them unless they do something about food, then they will do it.
Well, all the governments around the world, America, Canada, and Japan, the whole lot of them, they're all running on this rubbish they're telling the public to keep themselves in power.
Yeah, but
Now,
that's us.
They're all going on about we've got to build a new hospital. Why are they building a hospital? They should build a morgue. Laugh as you may. Laugh as you
No,
may.
you're right.
Could I suggest, Peter, that further questions, I'm sure that there are more questions, are said after the meeting, because as I said, poor man, Patrick isn't going anywhere very fast this evening after this, as he got to wait for me for a lift. We're climbing up. So, do stay on and have a glass of wine and chat to Patrick. Thank you very much, Patrick, for among the various thank yous I should be saying, I'd like to mention Chris Morris, who is a creative revivalist who I call my IT advisor, because I know what he is all about it. And he's been here at the back of the room with a video camera, and who has been recording this session, which, once I understand how to do it, and that Chris will have to do it for, will go on the rural website, www.ruraljersey.co.uk. So when that happens, I will email all those audience members whose email I've got, and let them know, so that if they want to see it again and perhaps sort of think more about what Patrick has said, they will be able to in that way. Now outside the room, as well as that champagne bucket which I mentioned earlier, there will be copies of rural and some recent back numbers for anybody who has a gap in their collection, as well as some books written by past speakers and by others. Now, there is a parallel series of speaker and other events taking place this year to celebrate the centenary of the Jersey Beekeepers Association, with the very appropriate title is the Honey Still Poutine, with apologies to Rupert Brooke. The organiser, Bob Hogg, if you'd like to set up and wave, Bob, is here this evening. So please talk to him afterwards for more details about what and where and so on. And when. Soon. What's within our next meeting is on 29th of June. And the speaker will be Russ Carrington, who's the, as you'll say, not named to conjugate, but he's the Executive Secretary of the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. He's also very active in the Young Farmers movement, so the meeting should be of particular interest to young farmers, and perhaps to would-be farmers, young and old, in the island. If you have not given me an email address, or this is your first time, and you haven't given it to me yet, would like to keep in contact for future events, please leave it with me before you go, or give it to Ruth, and Ruth would also like to wave in the far corner there. Please give it to us before you leave. So many thanks and good night.